things that go on. We all have our own strengths. And mine has definitely not been being on top of being on a computer because I just got back from a 2 week road trip through the Midwest and Southwest. So that was very fun, very inspirational. Uh, but yeah, I'm not the tech guy for the moment. Absolutely. Thank you, Shannon, for taking over.
So today
No worries.
we're going to be talking about outlining, why you should do it, the different ways to do it, and how it can benefit you. But first, let's introduce ourselves. Let's do name, what genres you work with, and are you a pantser, plotter, or something in between? So I am Daphne Strassert. I am an author and an editor working largely with romance and horror, and I am a super plotter. There is a spreadsheet and everything involved. So yeah, get me those outlines.
I'm Everett. I'm a also an editor at Homeworks. I write superhero, fantasy, sci-fi, sometimes a little bit of horror. Um, and I am absolutely somewhere in between. I like to do some outlining, but I'm definitely of the opinion that my outline does not dictate what my characters will do. If I get to a scene and decide something's better, I will absolutely toss out my outline in favor of what feels right in the moment.
I'm Sean Carroll. I usually edit science fiction and literary. I am very happy with outlining. It seems like the best of intentions. I am a loose outliner, and things change. I love the inspiration of being in the progress of writing, and something goes sideways, cool, follow it, see where that goes, as well as outlines are great before and after you are writing. So sometimes there's a benefit to not outlining and then fixing it later.
Hi, I'm Shannon Winton. I'm an editor with Tomeworks. I also teach editing science fiction and fantasy for the Editorial Freelancers Association, and I'm going to start teaching editing mysteries, thrillers, and suspense with them next year. I generally work with science fiction and fantasy. I don't do quite as much with romance, except for some like very specific subgenres. That being said, I am a begrudging outliner, and I say that because I started writing multiple books by the seat of my pants that never got finished. My particular brand of executive dysfunction allows me to follow an outline, but it does not allow me to initiate writing until I have the right feeling, which never ever shows up. And I've also written myself into a corner multiple times. So spending a week, 2 weeks, whatever, creating a strong outline and then creating a bare bones skeleton of a draft by putting the outline into like a planning document that will become the manuscript so that I remember what I'm supposed to do in this next chapter when I sit down to write helps me. I know not everybody has that particular brand of executive dysfunction. Some people do start an outline and then to them they feel like, well, I've written the book. I don't need to keep going. And then they can't start the manuscript. That's not me. That might be you. But for me, what I have found is that if I try to pants, I will frustrate myself. I will not finish. And all around, it'll be a bad time.
Shannon, I love that point about the done factor. Yeah, I have heard that when people are like, "Oh no, wait, I can't outline," because if I outline, I feel like the story is done. Like
Yeah,
once
that
you
they
go through
did
it
all the
once,
creative part
you
already.
can never watch a movie again. You can never, examine details in certain things. It it's interesting. I totally understand that is something that goes on for some people.
I do understand that because it is outlining for me is probably the most fun part of the creative process because it's figuring out what the story is. I do still want to see it in its completed form, which is what carries me through the rest of it, but I can absolutely agree that for some people, once you've got it figured out, once you've figured out the puzzle, it's no fun.
Yeah. I think in large part, and we'll get to the questions, you need to kind of have a better understanding of your own like brain mechanics. We're all kind of different in how our brain gets in the way of productivity. So I know for me and my specific mechanics, the outline is almost a comfort. again, I don't feel like I can't be creative because I have guideposts and I've got a path to walk. I am still creative at the line level. I'm still putting all these things together. But there's that thing where like, oh, it has to be perfect. The session has to be perfect, or I can't initiate. And the outline and having that in the document for me, staring me in the face, saying, you don't have to try that hard. I've already done the big part for you. Past Shannon really thought about you, current Shannon. Um, she had you. And then I can be like, okay, well, I can get started because this is like, if I spend 5 minutes just following instructions, then I've already gotten into the mode. I'm able to keep going. Usually I can finish a chapter in a session without too much pain, unless it's like a 10,000 word chapter, which shouldn't be anyway, and keep going. But again, that may not be how your brain works. So it's important to find a system or a process or general philosophy that works for your particular brain.
So Shannon really started touching on this already, but why should you outline?
Keep the momentum going, not go off sidetrack, to meter your work. If you are running a marathon and you are passing certain signposts along the way, that can really help you get to the end, without knowing where you're going or how long the race is going to be. Then it can be extremely difficult to reach the end. Shannon, you said that earlier about trying to write novels and not getting to the end. So much like an issue for emerging and budding writers all the time, is when inspiration fails. And so an outline is structure to make sure that you don't have to just burn on gas the whole time in order to get where you're going.
I'll say for me, the outline is less about the end usually when I'm doing outlining, and more about the beginning. I'm usually figuring out in my outline what's my premise, what's my setup, what are the characters' drives, goals, and stuff. It's me setting up all of the pieces so that when I start writing, I know pretty roughly how they'll start interacting, even if I don't have an ending outline. It's very similar to how I actually run a D&D session. I will have all my pieces laid out, but I will not dictate anything because, especially obviously with D&D, other people are making the creative choices. But, as I said earlier, I like to make creative choices, and I like to be surprised by where the plot goes sometimes. I like to let my characters kind of do what they want to do. Um, but that's generally what I view outlining for, is for setting up your characters and understanding their motivations and why they're in the plot.
For me, it's a lot about creating a cleaner draft. When you get through your first draft, if I try to pants something, first of all, I'll never finish. But if I try to pants something, what I'm going to end up with is a sagging middle, right? Where I don't have any of my plot beats carrying us through because I just kind of meandered and wrote whatever it felt like my characters would do next. And I need my characters to be using their motivations to get somewhere. And so what I like about outlining is knowing that my book's going to have the right pacing when it comes to the overall structure. Because so I outline based on word count. And this is where you might struggle if you are outlining for the first time and you don't know how long you want your book to be. It can become very difficult. So some things are easier for me to write than others, right? I struggle with action sequences, but I'm good at dialogue, and I don't want to end up with the action-packed part of my book being 10,000 words shorter than it needs to be because I don't enjoy writing it as much. So if you don't know how long you want your book to be, an outline can be kind of difficult to work with because you might know the plot points that you're going to hit, but you don't know how long you're going to spend on each of them. And it can create kind of a wonky final product.
I think one of the things that we haven't touched on, but is important for me when I outline, is that most of the time I have some sort of motivation, or I've got, some scene in my head, or I have part of a character arc, or, whatever it was that was like the inspiration for me wanting to work on a particular story. And a lot of writing is manipulation, right? We manipulate the reader into feeling a certain way. We manipulate the reader into experiencing these things with the characters. And so I have to build a very enticing candy house to get them where I want them to go, especially if it's something that's like negative or it's an epiphany that's like painful. I have to find a way to make it enjoyable and alluring. And so, like, in order to honor my inspiration, like I have to have the edifice. I can't just write to that inspiration, because no one will read my like gut punch. If I say gut punch here, no one's gonna read that, even if I finish it. So having the outline, figuring out where these enticements are, where the allure is, where the secondary plots are, that will lead back to that, that final either epiphany or what have you. And I'm making this sound very, I think, grandiose, when a lot of what I write is usually just like satire and fart jokes and stuff. But like getting getting that together and building that in, and reminding myself, hey, you have to, focus in on the themes in chapter 3, or you're going to need to make a reveal in chapter 2 that will pull the reader to to continue on until they hit chapter 8, where that becomes really important. That to me is a comfort in a weird way. Engineering is a comfort, because I know I've already thought about it, I've built it in. I can stare at it from afar and say, like, yes, this is strong structurally, but it's also going to make something that, my ideal reader, the person I'm trying to speak to, will get pulled in by, and I will have that emotive connection between them and my book. And to me, that like makes it worth writing. And so I love outlines in that respect. And again, I know not your brain may not be the same way, but for me, that is really beneficial, and it makes it feel like no matter how long this is going to take me, it's worth it.
If I can throw this out there, does anyone else outline based on themes? Because I'll have, like before starting work, like I love that you said, Shannon, like I want to turn, and that's what I base the story off of, or I want a vibe or a scene, and that's what I base the story off of. I like these broad strokes. I'm thinking about I 19th century Irish identity and how it changed going into the mid 20th century. Oh wow. I'm going to write a, vaguely space opera, near future fiction, and that's what I'm starting with. Like this theme of like family and forgetting and identity, and that's where I need an outline. That's where I start with theme and then go to outline. Anyone else have that? Where does theme place in your work?
Theme kind of comes up after the fact, right? So I'll do my outline, and my outline is very plot and character based. Because that's the kind of stories I write, right? You write literary fiction and I write romance. And so romance is much more formulaic, but it's also more about character arc and character growth than it is about theme. But the themes come later because every book has a theme. But I will focus largely on my character arcs. And Shannon said something that helped me a lot with that one time, which is, because I write romance, what percent are they in love at this part of the book, right? And it's got to come across, right? So at the beginning they don't know each other, and then by probably the 75% mark, because it's where the climax will be, they should be 100% in love, and it should be them versus the problem. And so having that gradual building up of how much they like each other has been very helpful.
I love that, like a video game. Like you're filling up the hearts of a certain
Yeah.
thing. It doesn't mean
The
you beat the
dating
game,
sim.
but you need to finish this before you can finish the rest.
Dating sim. I one thing I see online a lot, and I have had authors talk to me about, is, well, my characters just, I have an outline, but my characters just go a different direction. And this is not how my brain works. Because if my characters are not going to do what I need them to do, then they're not the characters I need, and I need to revise them. But people who do have that, let's hear about how you work with that and outlines.
For me, it's not necessarily that I'm like, oh, my characters changed the outline on me or whatever. It's more like when I set it up, I'm giving them a problem to solve, and me writing is figuring out how they're going to solve it. And I have a pretty good idea of how they're going to solve it based off of like, I set up, what are their skill sets? How do they approach problems? Ahead of time, so that way I can have a pretty good general idea. But if something occurs to me in the moment that feels very good, I'm going to pursue that. But, on the other hand, I have also had sequences that I've written and I went, oh, this just does not fit in the book. And I've had to throw them out. Or, sorry, not throw them out, but you should always save written material. But like remove it from this particular project and see if I can hold on to it for later.
I think there's always value in allowing your characters to side quest and then that not end up in your book. That can be a discovery journey for you. And you may end up revising your outline, or the plot of your story based upon that. But, a character side questing and responding in a way that you didn't originally expect is something that I think is great for discovery, for your own creative process. But I think there's a big difference between having that experience and putting in really what is emotional labor to learn who this person is, this character, and assigning that as necessary for the book, because sometimes it definitely is, it's great, it really works, and maybe you just need to reconfigure a couple of things, and it'll fit in there, and it does the work that sort of supports the rest of the story, and that's fantastic. And sometimes it either doesn't, or it doesn't do it in a way that's like beneficial to your pacing and your characters, and you can take the core and kernels of that side quest, and place them in a new scene, so you can evolve very large chapter into maybe a couple of paragraphs, but you did that labor, it is still valuable. And I think, again, one of the things that's really hard for a lot of authors is, I wrote it, it must be valuable for this. And the answer is like, it's quite valuable. It's valuable to you. And it is probably valuable independent. You may be able to release this as a short story or a gimme, or share it with your readership, so they can be like, oh, well, this is what happened when we were talking about these things that occurred off to the side. I remember this like 3 paragraphs in chapter 3 that were like really evocative, and now I know the full story. Cool. Ooh, sorry, I had a energy blip. I don't know if y'all can hear that big beat, but I apologize for that. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of dichotomy of like it's either good or it's not, and I think that's a false dichotomy, and that a lot of people fall into that thinking, and that's really creating a lot of strife.
If I can side quest the conversation for just a second and say that I love what the points that you're making, but it's reminding me as well of how memoirs are often written. And we're not talking about one memoirs right now, but this is the side quest. A lot of times memoirs are written as a whole bunch of series of chapters of things that have happened in someone's life. You have a scattered bunch of things. You might think that there's a general, road that your life goes on, but really there's a lot of stories in there, And once you have all those chapters done, then with your 37 chapters, you can figure out how in 22 to tell a certain story. And it's interesting to think that you could tell a different life story with a different combo of 22 chapters. That is not how fiction is usually written, but I love how it dovetails with what you're talking about. Okay, if this went this way, like it can come back. In terms of a memoir, you come up with the themes and the overart, the character arch after writing the chapters.
So let's get into actual outlining methods. What is your favorite one that you use or that you've heard of? I want to start with I have the one I use, but I'm going to start with the one that I am intrigued by, which is the snowflake method. So the snowflake method relies on this concept of fractals, which is if you take a fractal and you zoom in on it, it becomes like a smaller version of itself, or you build it out and becomes a bigger version of itself. So the snowflake method starts with a single sentence that explains your book. And that would be like your elevator pitch, right? So that's Scientists bring back dinosaurs and put them in a theme park. Elevator pitch, single sentence. And then you build that into a paragraph, you build that into a page, you build that into a scene, and then like a novella, and then into a novel. I'm intrigued by this because it's so, it's an interesting idea. It talks about like getting to the core of your story. It would really only work with high concept stories, but um, I would never use it because the leap from short story to novella is very big. And there would be quite a bit more work involved in that. But I like this idea of creating progressively larger chunks as you work with your story. And I think that starting with a short scene of your work before you get into the meat of it is a really good way of practicing your story.
I think it's a really good thing to use if your story is relatively simple, or if you have written yourself into a corner and you need to figure out how to get back out again, because it helps you zoom in and define what you're trying to write. And so when you're in the frustration of like, I don't know where to go from here, going backwards, like going to the basics of like, what is my story? Okay, now I see which route does not actually fit with that story. I think that's really helpful because the snowflake method is incredibly quick for the first like 5 steps. Once you get past a page, then it takes quite a bit longer. But that is actually where I would normally end up like rolling off the snowflake method when I was using it, was like once it got to a page length of outline and what was going on, I personally needed more understanding of what my physical beats were going to be than the snowflake method kind of naturally informs. They do want like this happens and it causes that to happen, but it isn't quite the same as like a structure that I could climb versus like a structure that's amorphous, if that makes sense. So for me, it didn't really work because I recognize I need the rigor of structure. So even though it provides some, it wasn't quite where I needed to be to like feel like I was confident in starting that novella element of it. But I think it's a really good one for you to sort of like mind map and think about to yourself, like, what does this story mean and what is it actually about?
I'll throw it out there.
Shatter.
I'll throw it out there and also throwing into the chat just a blog post I found really easily with a bunch of different story structures, outline structures. But I do like the 24 act. And it's very similar to Save the Cat or to Joseph Campbell's Hero. But basically, it's a list. And so, as I said, starting a theme and then working towards characters and setting, at least opening setting or setting that will occur at some point. I reading these 24 prompts essentially. This leads to that. This leads to that. And then just writing single sentences. And I like what Daphne was saying about building up, the snowflake method. And this is my way of building up because I'll have 1 or 2 sentences for all 24 of these acts. And then I have something to therefore look at. I go from 2 sentences to writing it. And this is just a prompt to keep me going. And as I said about the flame, like not letting it all burn out at the beginning, meter your inspiration.
I think, I don't know if my method has a name, but it is very character first. I like to figure that out. I have a method of figuring out what I think they're going to look like in the narrative by establishing what do they want, but also what is their internal need. And this can be, so like they have usually an external goal, which is what I call the want. And then for me, I come up with a kind of, sometimes it's contradictory, sometimes it's just adjacent, but there's like an internal need that conflicts with their external want. Usually that's, and in that segment is usually where I come up, or in that intersection is where I come up with like, what are their flaws? How do they cope with their need in a bad way? But also I figure out like, what are their main ways of trying to achieve their goal? you know, someone's going to work around their internal wounds in a way that is natural for them to approach certain problems a certain way. So I don't know if that has a name, but that's just how I generally like to set my characters up. And for me, once characters are set up, the story starts to emerge.
Shannon?
Daphne, what about you? Do you have a favorite?
Oh, I do. I do have a favorite. And if you guys go to our YouTube channel, you can watch me talk about it ad nauseum. But my way of doing things is the three act structure. And I created a whole spreadsheet, like I mentioned before, that explains like based on percentages of your story, what should be happening there. So in the first 10%, you're setting up your characters, and then you have your inciting incident. The next 10 to from 10 to 25%, they're adapting to a new situation. At the 50% mark, they face something that they have an opportunity to turn back and go back to life as it was before, but they choose to go onward. 50 to 75%, things are getting harder. It's looking a little bleaker. 75%, everything goes bad and it's the worst it's ever been, which brings us into our last push, 75 to like 90%, that gets you to the climax. You have the climax and the resolution is the last 10%. So that's what I do. If you want to know more about it, we have a whole writer's lunch that I did on it. But I am interested, Shannon, in what you do because I know you do something different from me.
So, well, mine is like advanced level fuckery versus like entry level. So I don't want to scare people off. I feel like we should talk about the hero's journey a little bit before we get to mine.
That's
But I
reasonable.
also know I've spoken a lot already this time.
No, no, no.
Um,
Talk about the hero's journey, or someone else can talk about the hero's journey if you want to talk about Save the Cat.
well, they're very close to the same thing. The hero's journey is a list that has a wandering number of benchmarks around. And so depending on which version you're looking at, it'll be 21, it'll be 18, it'll be just 9. And it's basically based on a book by Joseph Campbell called A Hero with a Thousand Faces, that came out in the early 1900s, well, early mid 1900s, where he, I want to say supposedly because the book is problematic if you actually go back and look at the history. He looked at a lot of like epic tales, of folklore, of the different like cultural stories about heroes and identified these common things. The book was written as like an anthropological study, not as a like guideline for how to actually write a story. Just like, hey, these are the things that are common. He kicked out anything Asian. He kicked out anything he didn't like. He kicked out anything that came from African belief systems. So it was like, hey, this is what I see in European tales, and also the stuff that I like. So some of his like distinguishing features are not truly accurate, and from that has come the hero's journey, and then from the hero's journey has come Save the Cat. But there's a basic three-act structure, which is you have an introduction in the normal world, which is like where the main character is generally living. So you get a sense of who they are before the adventure becomes, and then something usually bad happens that sets them on the path. In that space, there's usually a rejection of the adventure. It's the rejection of the call to adventure. And there's like a wizard character, and a final like severance essentially from the normal world where they are thrust into the adventure. And that begins Act Two. Act Two is what is normally called the fun and games period because they are learning new skills, and having battles and like achieving a lot of victories and building themselves up. Often there are some things that are, not great. They have to lose a little bit to be humbled. And then around Act Three, there is a major battle with for lack of a better point, like a cock up. And they lose someone they love or that's important to them. Most of the time, it is that wizard character. And when I say wizard, it's like the elder that guides them to knowledge. And they have a dark night of the soul, and then they recognize their intrinsic value and the need to be a hero, basically. They they regroup back together, and then there is a big final battle, and then there is a relatively short return to the normal world, which shows what has changed both in that normal world because of the hero's action, and then internally who the hero has become because of this and who they are now in this normal world. now that adventure, action, or fighting is no longer necessary. So that is a brief overview of what the hero's journey is supposed to look like. Now, this obviously leaves out a bunch of things: literary fiction, 4-act structures, amorphous structures, and stories that have action, but where the emotional arc is not connected to that action. It also leaves out romance because romance does not follow the hero's journey. It leaves out mystery because mystery does not follow the hero's journey. When you think about what is mostly written in fiction and what is mostly read in fiction, which is romance and mystery thriller, the majority of the books, you will probably be right, will have a hero's journey. But that is what we teach because it is like very obvious. It's got names for these different points, so it's easy and accessible. So it is good in that you can learn it. It's good in that you can identify these like hallmarks. You can identify the goalposts. And it's a great way to build your writing skills, but it's not necessarily the only thing you can do. Deb, you want to talk a little bit how about the Save the Cat guidelines are
I'm gonna do a little off beaten track thing for a second, and then we'll come back to to Save the Cat because I wanted to meet a couple of your points. So you talk about how Joseph Campbell in The Hero's Journey does not take into account literary and definitely doesn't take into account storytelling structures outside of Western civilization. And this is one of those things that is really important. So I've said before, and Sean corrected me, and I do agree with Sean, but I have said before that I think humans are wired to like stories being told a certain way with rising action, climax, and falling action. Now, that does depend on your culture because some cultures tell stories in different ways. And so that is a very Western centric view. So when we're talking about ways of outlining your novels, we're largely leading you in a direction that is popular and publishable. Not necessarily the most artistic merit, not necessarily what's best for your story or how you want to tell your story. Popular and publishable, which is why things like Save the Cat and The Hero's Journey and the 3-act structure work. They might be rigid, they might be formulaic, but Western audiences and a lot of the people that are purchasing books like those structures because they're what they're used to. And if you grew up reading those, you might find that you have an innate understanding of story structure. So the first book I ever wrote, I did not outline. And I went back and reverse outlined it, which we should talk about that in a minute. I went back and reverse outlined it later and found out that I had largely followed a typical story structure, a typical 3-act structure. Which was good because that meant that, I had already fit into the mold that I would need to if I was going to pursue publishing for this. And that's because I read a lot of books like that. So you might find that even if outlining sounds really intimidating, you are actually better equipped to go at it than you think you are. Back to Save the Cat.
and I want to make it clear, I'm not poo-pooing on the hero's journey in and of itself. I'm poo-pooing on the amount of significance that we have given this particular thing. Because it is a tool, but it's one tool among many, and you can certainly experiment with a lot of things, and it's a very easy, accessible tool. Go on for Save the Cat.
I mean, I don't know as much about Save the Cat as you do, so I'm gonna
throw this out there as well before we get there, talking about the formulaic and stuff like that. In this age, if we are talking about writing and doing things and being creative at the same time that people are taking shortcuts with AI, are trying to do things, that formulaic is like, that's what they have. That's what the AI has to breed off of. And so I'm very intrigued by how story structure in the coming decades might change as it's recognizable that AI does things a certain way in order to tell that something is human, to do something different.
Okay, cool. Well, the Save the Cat structure, and for some reason, the name of the author that wrote the original book escapes me, but Save the Cat was actually originally written for screenwriters so that they could hit specific beats at a certain time with the presumption that you're like writing the script for a movie that's going to be about 90 minutes long. And it basically takes from the same structure as the hero's journey, where by this point you have this, but it has a couple other things too, like in the movie, between like the first 10 minutes and the 15 minutes, you need to state your theme. And so normally this occurs because there's a secondary character that will actually ask your thematic question, like, do you want to live for your parents or do you want to live for yourself? Like stuff like that. So that the character who's like, our primary character is spending the rest of the movie answering that specific question and it's baked in. You don't have to wonder, what is this about? And there's certain other hallmarks that go into it. They did make Save the Cat Writes a Book. I think there's a secondary one that's like Save the Spooky Cat. There's a horror version. Daffy, it doesn't look like you know,
I'm
but
gonna have to look for that
there's
one.
like a slightly altered one for horror as well. Blake Snyder, that's the name of the author. So it's very prescriptive. There are some wonderful beat sheets if you need somebody to be really rigorous with you. There are some wonderful beat sheets you can find out there for Save the Cat that say, if you put in the length of the book, it will auto-populate at what word count these things need to happen, these different benchmarks. And so it'll tell you, like, if I'm making it up a little bit, but you're going to have a 150,000 word book, then by like word count 4,362, you have to have that theme stated, and it's incredibly prescriptive. And so most people, when they think about outlining, they kind of accidentally think about the Save the Cat version, which is like, you have no choice. You have to do these things. You cannot, you can't contemplate and like sit and spend 2 chapters doing this because you only have 500 words to do it. Um,
I
Sean's
want to
like,
throw
he
this
has
out there that you can teach yourself about outlines by watching movies. And the big blockbuster Hollywood movies are a great place to start because if you watch The Avengers, ma'am, you can pause it at the point that you're like, this is the inciting incident, pause, and you do the proportions of how long the movie is. They hit
10%.
those beats as prescribed, as written in the manual.
Which is frankly really impressive on the editor's part more than more than the scriptwriter's part because once you've got hours and hours and hours of footage to work with, it's really about paring it down.
So those are two very common things. I do think that they are great resources. I think writing skills are things that need to be valuable. And so to be valuable, you do need to learn the standards. You need to learn what you're going to be evaluated against. And that way, when you do transgress against those standards intentionally, you're doing it in a way that looks intentional. And I think one of the other things that happens is when people write something that veers far away, if they don't know essentially what they're making fun of by changing it up, then it becomes muddled. It's not obvious that this is part of their process or theme, or that the reader should be laughing with them. And so then it just looks like it's all by accident and the author doesn't know what they're doing. So I do think it's really important to study these things. If you are trying to like get really deep into process, but I don't think you necessarily have to use them all the time. I definitely think for some people there's a comfort in using outlines in a similar way that I've had comfort in them. So, going back to my original theme stated, it really depends on your your psychology and what works for you.
We're gonna head into our last question. If anybody has questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Or afterwards we'll have an opportunity for you to raise your hand. But our last question is about I've already written a book. How can outlining benefit me?
You're going to read it and you're going to write a summary. You're going to look at where you hit those beats and compare it to a plot structure that you identify with. Reverse outlining is great for revision, and it is something often that you should do before bringing something to an editor so that you're not
What's the
dealing
reverse
with
outline?
developmental editing. Reverse outline, read your book, write your outline of what happens as it is after writing it. Any more to the description?
Yeah, I mean, I
No,
go
because there's so many ways to do it.
there's a lot of ways to do it. But I would say like a couple sentence description of what happens in a scene. I usually break it up by scenes. Some people do it by chapters, but um what happens in the scene, whose POV was it, and put your word count on there because that's a really interesting tool, right? If you look at your reverse outline and realize that your dual POV novel is 80% one person, then perhaps you should revise it. And the idea is to look at it from sky high and be like, oh wow, I spent way too much time talking about trees. I need to I need to get my butt in gear and do a little more action on this.
Ian, do you ever reverse outline your books?
Uh, yes, I do. Sometimes. Sometimes I'll already have like a good strong idea about what I want to do when I get to the revisions, but sometimes I feel a little lost. And I definitely think, as we've said, reverse outline is very helpful for figuring out, like, if you cannot identify the issues on your own, and this is like your first pass before you're thinking about developmental editing or anything like that, I definitely think the reverse outline is useful.
It will help you identify missing parts in your story as well, where you will need to add in new scenes. And that's a big part of as you go. It's kind of like doing a developmental edit on your own work where you're looking at the substantive changes that you have to make before you think about grammar or line and paragraph structure.
I think you can do a scene breakdown that goes a little bit deeper, and it is something that I would suggest people who write science fiction and fantasy do, especially if you pantsed your novel and your world building is there on the page. So if you break down your scenes by what world building information is here, what actually gets used in the book now that I've written it, or background information for that character, whatever, what comes into play, and what is the actual plot of this scene? What are the changes that happen to the character internally and externally? It really helps you pare down your exposition and world building so that you can, I don't want to say speed up your plot, but so that your pacing can improve between, one draft and the next. So that is something that I think is also really helpful, even if you've already reversed outlined your book and then rewrote it to have all the plot points you're supposed to have. Getting deep into an actual like scene by scene kind of reverse outline or breakdown, I think is also going to help you better evaluate your own writing, especially if you start going story blind, and you have to look at it from an objective perspective because you've just seen it so much. Like if you reveal that her favorite flower is petunias and we never hear about it again, do we need that detail? So I think it can actually be helpful at the line level at a certain point.
Okay, at this point, we are open to questions from the audience.
Oh, I think you wanted me to talk about my ridiculous way of outlining too. So
I did,
go ahead.
didn't
I do think, if you have questions, please add them, but I'm going to talk a little bit about mine that Daphne finds fascinating. And I think she does it because I do it by chapter, and because I have no problem with that. And Daphne's way of writing is so very different. But normally I try to figure out approximately how long I want my book to be. And sometimes that's like, how long do I want to spend writing this? And how long do I want the story to actually take, which I know is very weird to you guys. One of the things that this has actually lent well to is when I have the classes that I teach, I create a novella that's bad on purpose. And so I have to have a really good outline and I have to know how long it is so that I don't end up giving them too much to read when they're trying to do this class that is functionally very short. And I don't want to overwhelm them. So I will take my estimated length, let's say 60,000 words. And I know that I just generally write chapters that are between 3,000 words and 3,500 words. Just happens to be my norm. And so I'll presume 3,000 words per chapter, and then I will, create my outline, 1, 2, 3, whatever, until I hit that word count. So for, a book that's 60,000 words long, that would be 20 chapters. And I normally do a 3 act structure. So I know approximately when we have to break from the normal world. I know when the fun and games are, and then I know where the ramp up to the climax is and where my final chapters are going to be. But inside of the details of what's going on there, I will usually put my physical actions that are going to occur the emotional changes inside of my character or the thematic information. So my outline looks really funky because it'll be like he kicks her ass, and then like she realizes her mother never loved her. And, like, both of these things have to align. And so that's what it is. It's essentially a story prompt per chapter where I have to figure out a way to add all of these things. And then depending on what genre I'm in, I also have to reveal certain things like specific world building. And if I know that there's going to be reveals later on that are important to like the climax, I've got to build in the foreshadowing. So I will have sections like you also have to add this. And so I'll end up having like 7 to 17 different elements that have to fit into this 3,000 word chapter. And then when I get down to it, I got to figure out how to make work. And so for me, it's not actually like a paralyzing thing where I've already been told exactly what the story is and it's rigid and I have no choices. It's incredibly fun because it ends up being like this is a story prompt with characters I've used before. And I just have to figure out how to add all these things in. And if something doesn't make it in, then I have to go back to the outline and figure out where I can put it, or I have to revise to get it in there. But if you've ever written a story where it's like, oh, I've got a set of keys, a doctor, and the moon disappears. It's kind of like that, but more complicated. And so it's a lot of fun. And then I will take basically a synopsis of the things that I think I need to have. I will turn my outline into synopses of what needs to happen in the chapter, and then I will add that to the document that will become my first draft. And so it'll be like chapter 1, and then I will have my synopsis to write from. That way I don't have to go fiddle through a bunch of different things. It's already in paragraph form. So if everything is really terrible, I will take each sentence and I will like space them out so that I can write to that sentence and then actually make it into something prosy and beautiful later. And it's already done, in some respects for me right there, so that if I'm not feeling it that day, if I just had a fight with my sibling or, my kid is sick or what have you, and I've only got 30 minutes to work, I can much more easily like get into the writing mode rather than have to deliberate and remind like where was I again, what happened in the last chapter, like who am I writing this point of view from, like all of those things are avoided, all of those executive function detours are out the window. And so the process of making that outline and doing that can take a while. Like if you are creating an outline, even if you're not doing it in my ridiculous way, don't feel bad if it takes you a really long time. Like Daphne, how long does it take you to make your outlines?
Oh God, some of them are very, very fast. Some of them are significantly slower. It really, because it does depend a little bit on story inspiration. But I've done some where I can put it together in 4 hours, and I've done others where it takes me about a week.
Yeah.
It really depends, and it also depends on how complicated the stories are. Because straightforward stories are always going to be easier to outline.
Yeah, for me, because I'm putting it there and I'm doing a lot of revision to the outline itself,
Mhm.
comfortably, if I'm only working on the outline, I would say about 2 weeks for me. And again, because, instead of revising an entire draft, I'm revising the outline. So if I'm looking at it and, I'm seeing inside of this, one column that is about the epiphany that, oh shit, like my parents aren't my parents, they actually stole me from somebody else. And I've had to lay all these breadcrumbs in. And I'm like, that's not working, then I have to reconfigure where
Mhm.
the breadcrumbs are, what they are, and if I even want to have this subplot. So that all gets done in that contracted outline versus like I wrote the whole book and I realized it's not working. And now I have to go rewrite an entire book. So I'm
Mhm.
very comfortable with my outlining process taking quite a while comparatively. And then again, like if you don't work on it all the time because you're busy, you have kids, you have work, you have chronic chronic responsibilities. You have chronic diseases. You have other responsibilities. Like stuff gets in the way. I would be, in the times where I'm super busy, I'm not mad at myself if the outline takes a really long time because for me, the outline is the thing that takes the longest. I would say per word, and then the rest of the work, the actual writing the book, sometimes takes less time than it did to make the outline itself.
Mhm.
And again, it just what works for you is important, but that's what works for me.
Okay. Well, we do not have writer's lunch next week because it's July 4th break. But we will be back on July 9th with Anna Hawkins, topic to be determined.
I want to mention one other thing that's going to change, not during Anna's, but soon in July, we are going to be switching from Zoom to Google Meet. This shouldn't impact you very much. We do have a new permalink for totally different reasons. If you found us, great. If not, our new permalink, I believe, is writerslunch.tomeworksediting.com, but y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. But that will take you there as well. And some of the, functionality of Meets is a little bit different than Zoom. But overall, we're still going to be here. We're just going to be, on a different platform.
Yep. Download Meets in the meantime. Most of the time, it's already on your computer, without even if you don't use it.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.